What if every heartbreak you've survived wasn't proof that you're unlovable, but a reflection of what you were trained to tolerate? Carl Jung saw it long before anyone else. If you don't know these 44 truths, people will keep hurting you, and you'll keep letting them. Have you ever felt the sting of being hurt by someone who never raised their voice, never slammed a door, never uttered a cruel word, but somehow left you feeling erased, hollowed out, or quietly ashamed? That's not in your head. That's the signature of an emotional wound most people will never validate, and it's the wound that Carl Jung spent a lifetime trying to name. Because people don't always hurt you in obvious ways. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's polite, sometimes it's dressed up in care and civility. But just because it's quiet doesn't mean it's harmless. In fact, the most dangerous injuries are the ones no one else sees, the ones that make you question your own sanity, the ones that leave no bruises, only echoes. And if you're honest with yourself, you've been here before. You've walked out of rooms feeling heavier than when you walked in. You've questioned your worth in relationships where you were told you were loved. You've carried guilt that was never yours, and pain that didn't start with you, but somehow it found its way into your body. Jung saw this for what it was, a psychological blind spot, a kind of unspoken contract that we sign with the world when we're too young to read the fine print. A contract that says, if I make myself small enough, quiet enough, good enough, maybe I'll finally be safe. But here's the truth no one tells you. The people who keep hurting you, they aren't always evil. They're often just unconscious. Unconscious of their own wounds. Unconscious of their own shadows they project. Unconscious of the fact that your silence makes their dysfunction more comfortable. Jung called this shadow blindness, the refusal to face the rejected, repressed parts of the self. And when someone refuses to meet their own shadow, they will always try to control yours. So they call you sensitive, they say you're overreacting, they dismiss your feelings as drama, or worse, they quietly withdraw their affection until you perform again. Smile, conform, apologize, shrink. And the most painful part? You do, not because you're weak, but because you were taught to see love and pain as synonyms. That's the first truth you need to remember. If you don't define your worth, others will discount it. Every time you stay silent when your body screams for you to speak, you teach the world that your value is flexible, negotiable, a currency to be bartered with. And when someone sees that, they don't step back, they step in, they take. Not always maliciously, sometimes just because they can. Truth two? The people who benefit from your silence will always call your truth selfish. The moment you begin to name your needs, you'll feel the backlash. They'll say you're too much, you've changed, you've become difficult. But it's not your voice they fear, it's the power you reclaim by using it, because your truth disrupts their control. And if you've ever felt your own anger rise, not in rage, but in a quiet simmering heat, you've felt your shadow trying to protect you. Jung didn't see the shadow as something evil. That's truth three. The shadow isn't dangerous. What's dangerous is pretending it doesn't exist. That anger, that ache in your stomach when someone disrespects you, that's not dysfunction. That's your soul setting off alarms, and it only screams when you've been trained to ignore the whispers. Let me ask you something. How many times have you told someone, "Don't talk to me like that," only to stay when they did? How often have your words been outshouted by your behavior? Truth four, people don't respond to what you say, they respond to what you tolerate. You can recite every boundary in the book, but if you don't back it up with action, your energy rewrites your message. And they hear what you don't say louder than what you do. And here's the insidious part. When you get hurt, what's the first thing you do? You apologize. "I'm sorry. I'm just tired. Sorry if I overreacted. Sorry for bringing it up." But what if I told you that every time you say sorry for your pain, you're training yourself to disappear? That's truth 5. Every apology you make for being hurt is a lesson in self-erasure. Somewhere along the line, you learned that your feelings were inconvenient, that expressing pain made you dramatic, that emotional needs were liabilities, and so you started editing yourself, not for clarity, for survival. And this is what Jung meant when he said that trauma doesn't just change what we fear, it changes what we look for. Truth 6. Trauma teaches you to find love in the same shape as your suffering, so you keep chasing people who feel familiar, not safe. You attach to what mirrors your past, not what honors your future. And when you do finally find someone kind, your body doesn't trust it, because kindness feels foreign, and familiarity, no matter how painful, feels like home. You've convinced yourself that if you can just be more agreeable, more understanding, more adaptable, then maybe finally you'll be loved fully. But that's not love. That's performance. Truth 7. If someone's love requires you to betray yourself, it's not love. It's an unspoken transaction, one where you lose by default every time you shrink, bend, or disappear just to keep the illusion of connection alive. So here's the question that begins to unravel the entire web. Who taught you that being invisible was safer than being real? Was it a parent's cold tone, a teacher's glare, a partner's conditional affection? Because whoever it was, they taught you something lethal, that your value depends on how little space you take up. And now, here you are, bleeding in silence, carrying the weight of other people's discomfort, mistaking endurance for intimacy, calling pain loyalty, and wondering why it keeps happening again and again. But Jung knew the answer. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you'll call it fate. This is not fate, this is programming. But now you've seen it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You don't need to scream, you don't need to fight. You just need to remember. You were never too sensitive. You were just too awake in a world that wanted you asleep. You probably don't remember the exact moment it happened, the moment you first put on the mask. Maybe it was subtle, a single look of disapproval when you laughed too loud, a sharp word when you cried, a door that closed when you finally said how you really felt. It didn't take much, just enough to teach you that parts of you weren't welcome. So you hid them. You got quiet. You got easy. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You nodded when you wanted to walk away. And somewhere along the way, you forgot who you were before you started editing yourself for other people's comfort. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to be accepted, to be loved, to survive in a world that rewards conformity and punishes truth. It's not fake, it's protective. But the longer you wear it, the more you forget that there's something underneath. And here's the cruel trick of it all. It works. You get praised for being agreeable. You get validation for being low maintenance. You get labeled the chill one, the nice one, the easy to talk to one. People love that version of you, the one who doesn't make waves, the one who listens more than she speaks, the one who comforts everyone but herself. But there's a cost, and it's never paid in applause. It's paid in silence, in emptiness, in resentment that builds like a quiet storm behind your eyes, because even when people love you, they don't really know you. They love the role, the function, the character you play in their emotional theater, but the real you? She hasn't shown up in years, not fully. Truth 8. The mask you wear to be loved becomes a cage. You wear it so well that eventually it wears you. It tells you what to say, how to feel, when to speak. And the more you adapt to it, the less you remember what your unmasked self even looks like. You become so fluent in emotional self-denial that your own needs start to sound foreign. And still, you keep going. You keep being available, keep offering comfort, keep absorbing pain that was never yours. Because somewhere deep down, you believe that your value lies in being easy to handle, easy to hold, easy to leave without guilt. Truth 9. Emotional labor without reciprocity is exploitation. You give, and they call it love. But when you need something, when you're not okay, when you're the one falling apart, they vanish, not because you're hard to love, but because they were never really loving you. They were consuming you, and the second you stop being digestible, they lose interest. But here's the part that hurts the most. You've trained them to do it. You've taught them that you don't need as much, that you're fine without acknowledgement, that your boundaries are flexible, that you'll stay no matter how many pieces you have to break into just to keep the peace. Truth 10. You teach people how to treat you by what you allow. The first time can be a mistake, but the second, the third, that's a lesson. That's your silence becoming permission. And people will keep cashing in on your invisibility until you decide that you're no longer a discount version of yourself. But maybe the hardest truth to swallow is this: even people who get you can still hurt you. Even those who seem emotionally intelligent, who say the right words, who understand your trauma, who mirror your pain, because insight without integrity is just another weapon. Truth 11. Not everyone who understands you deserves access to you. Awareness isn't love. Understanding isn't safety. Manipulators can speak the language of healing. They can echo your stories, mimic your depth, and still use your vulnerability against you. Just because someone can see your soul doesn't mean they should be trusted to hold it. And maybe this is where it finally hits you. That sick feeling in your stomach when you agree to something you didn't want. That energy drop after a conversation that looked normal on the outside but left you spinning inside. That sudden need to withdraw, to go quiet, to disappear. That's not anxiety. That's not you being too sensitive. That's truth 12. You're not too sensitive. You're just finally listening to your nervous system. Your body knows before your brain does. It feels the shift. It feels the manipulation. It feels the moment you betray yourself to be liked, and it tells you, over and over again, through tension, through exhaustion, through that quiet ache in your chest when you laugh at something that isn't funny, just to keep the moment light, and you wonder why you're tired all the time. You wonder why your joy feels muted, why your presence feels performative, why even when people say they love you, you feel unseen. It's not because you're broken. It's because you've spent years learning that disappearing is the safest way to exist. But safety isn't the same as freedom. Truth 13. Loyalty to dysfunction is not virtue, it's conditioning. You learned to stay in places that hurt because leaving felt like failure. You learned to forgive too quickly because holding others accountable felt dangerous. You learned to justify mistreatment because questioning it threatened your idea of what love was supposed to look like. But Jung would ask you, are you loyal or just afraid? Afraid of being alone, afraid of disappointing someone, afraid of finally choosing yourself and finding out who doesn't follow. But staying in pain doesn't make you strong, it makes you lost. And if you've ever felt that someone only loved you when you were easy to love, when you were agreeable, calm, emotionally available, without ever asking for anything in return, then you already know truth 14. If someone only loves you when you're easy to love, it's not love. It's consumption. The moment you say no, the moment you disagree, the moment you're not performing softness, they pull away, and it feels like rejection, but it's actually revelation. Because they weren't loving you, they were feeding on your compliance, your comfort, your silence. And now you're starting to see it. The mask, the cage, the way you've been trained to mistake emotional suppression for maturity, the way you've been praised for being low Mantorten when really you were just emotionally abandoned. But Jung didn't believe the answer was to swing into bitterness or rebellion. He believed in integration. in individuation, in reclaiming the parts of yourself that you locked away to feel acceptable. You were never meant to be easy to handle. You were meant to be whole. There's a kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, a quiet, aching depletion that builds not from what you do, but from what you keep giving that no one sees. You smile, you listen, you absorb, you hold space for people who never hold space for you, and somewhere along the way you stopped asking if you were okay, because you were too busy making sure everyone else was. It looks like empathy, it even feels like love, but it's not. It's sacrifice, conditioned, automatic, expected. Carl Jung warned us, when the self is not respected, empathy becomes a weapon, used not only by others but against yourself. Because when you believe that love means giving everything, even when nothing is returned, you're not being compassionate. You're bleeding. This is where overgiving becomes your weakness, not because your heart is too big, but because your boundaries are too soft. Because you are trained to believe that your worth is measured by how much you can endure without complaint. Truth 15. Over-explaining is a trauma response disguised as logic. You think if you can just make them understand, if you can say it clearly enough, calmly enough, kindly enough, they'll finally treat you the way you deserve. But over-explaining doesn't come from clarity, it comes from fear. The fear that being direct makes you unlovable. The fear that saying no without an essay makes you cold. And so you flood conversations with justifications and disclaimers, hoping that empathy will protect you. But it never does. Not with people who are committed to misunderstanding you, because that's the trap. The need to be understood keeps you chasing people who were never listening to begin with. And it starts early. As a child, you may have learned that your emotional survival depended on being attuned to others, that if you could just anticipate the mood, absorb the tension, mediate the conflict, you'd be safe. That love was earned through emotional service. Truth 16. Healing will make you unrecognizable to people who only knew you broken, because the moment you stop playing therapist to people who won't do the work, the moment you stop sacrificing your peace for their chaos, you become difficult. Not because you've changed in a bad way, but because you've stopped bleeding for people who refused to heal. But here's what no one tells you. Love that doesn't evolve expires. Truth 17. If your love isn't allowed to evolve, it will expire. Relationships don't end because of arguments. They end when one person grows and the other refuses to. Because growth demands new dynamics. It demands truth over comfort. But if someone is only interested in the version of you that gives without asking, that listens without being heard, that holds everything together without ever falling apart, they don't love you. They love the function you serve. This is where trauma complicates things. As trauma doesn't just shape what hurts you, it shapes what you're drawn to. When you've been conditioned to equate love with service, you start tolerating one-sided connections. You confuse exhaustion with depth. You confuse empathy with intimacy. You keep pouring yourself into broken wells and calling it loyalty. And worse, your empathy gets used against you. Truth 18. People fear your boundaries when they benefited from your lack of them. The moment you say enough, they say you've changed. They accuse you of being harsh, guarded, distant. But it's not about you being cruel. It's about them losing access, losing control. What they really mean is, your self-respect is now limiting what I can take from you. And that's when the manipulations start. They'll remind you of the times you were close. They'll say you're cold. They'll play the victim. Not because they want to reconnect, but because they want the old you back. The one who didn't ask for anything. The one who gave endlessly without ever questioning if it was mutual. Truth 19. When you stop over-explaining, manipulators lose their grip, because confusion is their currency. Endless dialogue, circular conversations, making you feel like if you could just find the right words, everything would be okay. But clarity is not a negotiation, it's a declaration. And when you finally say, "This is what I need," This is what I won't tolerate. Without softening the edges, they fall silent. Because there's nothing left to manipulate. No more angles to exploit, just a truth they can't reshape. That silence, that calm, it's not a loss, it's freedom. But you might feel guilty for it. Because when you've spent your life defining love by how much you can suffer through, peace feels unnatural, it feels selfish. You might still think your compassion is your most sacred gift, and it is, but only when protected. Truth 20. Empathy is only a gift when it's protected by discernment. You've given it to everyone. The ex who manipulated you, the friend who only calls when she needs something, the family member who weaponizes guilt. You've confused understanding someone with owing them access. But understanding does not require endurance. You can see someone's pain and still choose yourself. That's not cruelty, that's wisdom. So let me ask you, how many people are you holding space for that don't even respect the space you live in? How many relationships still exist because you're afraid of what will happen if you stop explaining, stop softening, stop sacrificing? The truth is, healing isn't just about understanding your wounds. It's about questioning the templates you've been using to survive, the patterns that once kept you safe, but now keep you small. Truth 21. The desire to be understood can make you tolerate the intolerable. You keep explaining yourself to people who've already decided not to hear you. You keep hoping that your vulnerability will melt their defenses, that if you show them your heart, they'll finally show you theirs. But not everyone has the capacity to meet you there, and the longer you try, the more you betray yourself. So stop waiting for them to understand. You don't need to be understood to be whole. You don't need to explain your boundaries for them to be real. You don't need to keep bleeding so someone else can feel warm. This empathy is not martyrdom. Compassion is not compliance. And love, real love, never demands that you disappear to keep it alive. You are allowed to protect your energy. You are allowed to say no without guilt. You are allowed to stop carrying what was never yours. And maybe for the first time you're starting to believe that. There's a kind of manipulation so subtle it doesn't feel like manipulation at all. It feels like concern, like disappointment, like a long, quiet stare across the dinner table. No words, no argument, just an energy shift that makes you question your own reality. And that's how it starts, the game you never agreed to play. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He saw projection not as a flaw in communication, but as a defense mechanism that, when unchecked, becomes a psychological weapon. Not all harm is loud. Some of the most dangerous wounds are inflicted by people who never raise their voice, never say anything cruel, and still leave you feeling broken. Projection is what happens when someone refuses to face what's inside them, so instead, they assign it to you. Their shame becomes your responsibility. Their insecurity becomes your fault. Their pain becomes your burden to soothe. And the worst part? If you've been conditioned to question yourself before you question others, you won't even notice it happening. You'll internalize it. You'll say, maybe I am selfish, maybe I was too harsh, maybe I should have said it differently. You'll explain, you'll justify, you'll apologize for things you didn't do just to keep the connection alive. Because the game isn't about facts, it's about control. Truth 22. When someone crosses your boundary and then gets offended, you've exposed their entitlement. A healthy person, when you express a need, listens, adjusts, responds with maturity. An unhealthy one retaliates, not because your boundary is wrong, but because they were never planning to respect it in the first place. So they sulk, they withdraw, they don't fight you, they ghost you emotionally, they stop texting as much, they cancel plans, they speak in clipped tones, and when you finally ask what's wrong, they say, nothing. But it's not nothing, it's punishment. Truth 23. You are not responsible for the emotional reactions of people you've outgrown. Guilt will whisper, be softer, be nicer. be less direct. But growth isn't cruelty, it's clarity. And if your evolution wounds someone who only knew how to relate to you when you were shrinking, that's not your failure, that's their limit being revealed. Still, if you're empathic, if you've spent years adapting yourself to avoid conflict, you'll feel the pull, the desire to fix it, to make it right, to bring harmony back. But here's the thing. Truth 24. People don't leave when you become toxic. They leave when you become self-respecting. They vanish when you stop apologizing for having needs, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop absorbing their moods like it's your job to regulate them. Because self-respect doesn't feed codependency, it starves it, and the people who are feasting on your flexibility will feel the loss of access as betrayal. So they double down. They shift the blame. They say you've changed, you're distant, you're not who you used to be, and they'll say it with sadness, concern, or sometimes rage, but underneath all of it is this one truth. You've stopped playing the role. And now they don't know what to do with you, because what they wanted wasn't connection, it was compliance. This is where projection becomes most dangerous, not just in what they accuse you of, but in what they make you feel. You say no, and they call you selfish. You ask for space, and they call you cold. You speak your truth, and they say you're attacking them. But pause and ask yourself, is this reaction truly about you? Or is it about their inability to tolerate your clarity? Truth 25. Your triggers are not flaws, they are messengers. The next time someone tells you you're too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, ask yourself what memory just got touched. What part of your story is being reawakened? Because triggers are not signs of weakness, they are invitations. Not to regress, but to remember what you once couldn't express. And this is why projection is so seductive, because it preys on your blind spots. It knows where your guilt lives. It knows the exact tone that makes you feel like a bad person, like you're failing someone. That's not an accident, that's design. Truth 26. Projection is when someone accuses you of being the very thing they're afraid to face in themselves. They say you're controlling when they're the ones manipulating. They say you're cold when they've been withholding affection for weeks. They say you're overreacting when you're simply responding to their silence with truth. And you'll start to wonder if you're imagining things. But you're not. You're just seeing the pattern for what it is. Jung said that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. What he didn't always say out loud is how many people will fight to keep that unconsciousness alive, because it protects their illusions. It spares them from accountability. It allows them to keep projecting their unexamined pain onto you and call it love. And if you've ever felt like your healing made someone else uncomfortable, that's no coincidence. Truth 27. Some people are addicted to your dysfunction because it validates their own. You were easier to be around when you were anxious, when you doubted yourself, when you needed them. But now? Now your clarity reflects their confusion. Your strength highlights their avoidance. And your growth? It makes their stagnation impossible to ignore. So they try to pull you back, not always with cruelty, sometimes with affection, sometimes with nostalgia, but the moment you refuse to shrink, their admiration turns to resentment, because you are no longer easy to control. And that's where the final trick of this game reveals itself. Truth 28. When someone withdraws love as punishment, it was never love. It was leverage. That cold shoulder, that sudden silence, that emotional shutdown. You felt it. The sting of being iced out, not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped complying. That wasn't love retreating. That was control collapsing. And here's the part that burns. They may never admit it. They may never say, "You're right." They may never apologize for projecting "poor ye," for guilt-tripping, for twisting your awareness into a leash. But they don't have to, because now you see it. And once you see it, you don't play the game anymore. You walk off the board, you reclaim your awareness, you stop managing their insecurities, you stop translating your boundaries into a softer language, you stop asking permission to honor what you already know. Because awareness isn't a liability, it's your liberation. And you don't owe anyone an apology for waking up. There's a moment, quiet, unceremonious, when you stop explaining yourself, you stop justifying your tone, you stop editing your words, you stop rehearsing how to say no in a way that sounds soft enough not to scare anyone, and in that moment, something radical happens. You choose yourself, not because you want to hurt anyone, not because you're cold or cruel or distant, but because you finally realize that the peace you keep trying to build with others is costing you your own. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not a dramatic explosion. It's a slow shedding, a subtle awakening. One day you get a message that drains you just reading it, and instead of replying with your usual emotionally laborious response, you don't answer. Not because you're punishing them, but because you're done performing closeness where there is none. Carl Jung knew that clarity isn't loud. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a soft no, spoken firmly, or no words at all, just a decision, a shift, a boundary that doesn't bend anymore. And that's the beginning of the turning point. But first comes the fear of being selfish, that programmed panic that says, if you don't explain your needs, defend your boundaries, or justify your absence, you're somehow in the wrong. That voice doesn't come from your truth. It comes from the part of you trained to equate love with emotional labor, the part of you that was praised for how much you could take, not how well you could protect your own peace. And yet, deep down, something in you knows you can't keep bleeding for people who flinch at your healing. Truth 29. You don't have to explain your boundary. You just have to enforce it. They'll ask you why. They'll push for reasons. They'll frame your distance as overreaction, your silence as spite. But this isn't a courtroom. You're not required to plead your case. Your boundary isn't a discussion, it's a decision. And if it feels like a locked door, that's because it is. Finally. And yes, it will disturb people, especially those who got comfortable with your availability, your softness, your emotional open-door policy. They'll push against it, try to guilt you back into compliance, say you've changed. They're right. Truth 30. You don't owe anyone continued access to a version of you they feel entitled to. You've changed. You don't laugh at the same jokes. You don't chase anymore. You don't smile to soothe someone else's discomfort while swallowing your own. That's not rudeness. That's evolution. That's what it looks like when a soul finally decides that self-respect is not optional. And what happens when you step into this clarity? It gets quiet. Not just outside, but inside. The obsessive need to manage every conversation, the compulsion to explain why you feel what you feel, it fades. Because suddenly, you don't need to be understood, you need to be whole. And that wholeness doesn't depend on approval. Jung believed that each person must undergo a symbolic death, the death of the false self, the part of you built for survival rather than authenticity. And this death isn't loud, it's dignified, it's calm, because once you stop arguing with people who benefit from your confusion, you finally start hearing yourself. Truth 31. Your peace will trigger those who rely on your chaos. They'll say you've become distant, boring, aloof. But what they really mean is they can't find you in the patterns anymore. You're no longer reactive. You're no longer spilling energy in every direction. Your silence, once mistaken for submission, has become your shield. and they don't know how to reach you now that you're no longer available for self-destruction. You'll hear the accusations, "You don't care anymore. You've changed. You think you're better than us." But none of it touches you, because you know something they don't. Truth 32, if you have to beg someone to understand you, they're committed to misunderstanding you. You don't have to audition for love. You don't have to perform for empathy. If someone can only hear you when you whisper your truth through trembling lips, they don't deserve your voice at full volume. And maybe, for the first time, you stop chasing closure. You stop over-explaining what should be obvious. You stop giving second and third chances to people who knew exactly what they were doing the first time. It's not about being bitter, it's about being done. Truth 33. Some people don't want resolution, they want control. They'll stall, provoke, delay, not because they're seeking truth, but because they're afraid of what it would mean to lose their grip on you. Jung understood this deeply. When a person refuses to confront their unconscious, they'll try to control yours instead. They'll keep the conflict going, not to fix it, but to keep you circling around them, confused and off-center. But clarity is a wall they can't climb. It's not an invitation, it's a boundary, and that's when they start to call you cruel. But you're not cruel, you're clear. And clarity, to someone who thrived in your confusion, will always feel like punishment. But this is where your liberation begins. Truth 34. The most dangerous gaslighting is when you do it to yourself. When you say, "Maybe I'm asking for too much." When you question your reality just because someone else can't meet you in it. When you silence yourself not because you're wrong, but because you're afraid of being left. But ask yourself, where did that voice come from? Who taught you that your pain should be private, that your needs are negotiable? That voice isn't yours. It was given to you by people who benefited from your silence. And now you're giving it back. Truth 35. Self-abandonment wears many disguises. Loyalty, sacrifice, love, even spirituality. But if you have to disappear to stay connected, it's not devotion. It's a spiritual wound, a soul cut in the shape of people-pleasing. And no amount of meditation or therapy can replace the simple, sacred act of saying, "No, I will not shrink to keep you comfortable." This is what happens when you finally honor your inner yes and your inner no, not because you've learned to say the words, but because you've stopped fearing what comes after. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. You just close the door, not with rage, not with drama, just with finality. You stop checking your phone. You stop waiting for them to understand. You stop rehearsing the speech. Because you've outgrown the need to explain why your peace matters more than their comfort. And that is the moment your real life begins. Healing doesn't always feel like peace. Sometimes it feels like grief, like losing everything you thought was love, like waking up from a dream where you were always the one apologizing, always the one trying harder, always the one bending yourself into smaller shapes just to fit into someone else's emotional comfort zone. When you finally begin to heal, you don't just lose people, you lose identities, roles, versions of yourself that you built for survival, not joy. And that's where the pain sneaks in. Not because you miss the pain itself, but because the pain was familiar. Because even the most dysfunctional love still feels like connection when you've never experienced anything else. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the death of the false self. The self that learned to stay quiet to keep the peace. The self that prioritized emotional safety over authenticity. The self that became whatever others needed just to feel wanted. But individuation doesn't ask you to add more. It asks you to shed, to unlearn, to let go of the parts of you that were never really you, but adaptations. Beautiful, brilliant adaptations that help you survive a world that couldn't hold your full truth. And as you start to reclaim yourself, you'll feel it, the rupture, the inner revolt, because healing isn't gentle. It's a rebellion, a psychological revolt against the parts of you that were taught love means disappearing. And the revolt hurts, not because it's wrong, but because it's working. Truth 36. You are not difficult, you are just not willing to self-destruct quietly anymore. And that terrifies people, especially those who only knew you through your silence, especially those who mistook your compliance for kindness, your burnout for devotion. You've stopped bending, you've stopped bleeding. And to people who were nourished by your self-erasure, your clarity feels like cruelty. But that's not your problem anymore. You're not here to be digestible. You're here to be whole. And that wholeness, it comes with solitude. You will lose people, you will lose places, you will lose dynamics that once felt like home. But ask yourself, was it really home? Or was it just the most comfortable version of abandonment you could find? Truth 37. People who never had boundaries will always see yours as cruelty. You'll be called guarded, rigid, cold, but their discomfort is not your responsibility. Their emotional literacy is not your job. You weren't born to be everyone's translator, everyone's cushion, everyone's therapist. You were born to become yourself. And becoming yourself means saying goodbye to the old self, the one who said yes too quickly, the one who tolerated emotional crumbs, the one who justified silence as love and distance as depth. And it hurts, because even dysfunction can feel like safety when it's all you've ever known. Truth 38. Manipulators confuse empathy with access. They think if you understand them, you owe them. But you don't. You can see someone's pain and still say no. You can feel their sadness and still walk away. Understanding someone does not mean you have to keep sacrificing your sanity to prove it. And this is where the growth grief sets in. Not just mourning what you lost, but realizing what you accepted for so long. All the times you were loyal to pain. All the ways you kept showing up for people who wouldn't cross the street for you. All the versions of yourself you had to kill just to be enough for people who were never ready for your truth. But grief is not regression. Grief is integration. It means you're finally honest about what it costs you. And it means you're finally ready to stop paying that price. Truth 39. You can love someone deeply and still choose yourself completely. Choosing yourself isn't betrayal. It's sacred. It's saying, I refuse to lose me just to keep you. Love is not about depletion. It's about overflow. And if you're constantly running on empty, constantly begging for scraps, constantly over-explaining your value, you're not in love, you're in survival. And survival will never satisfy a soul that's ready to thrive. That's why it hurts so much to let go. Because for so long your nervous system was wired to equate chaos with connection, to believe that if love didn't feel like anxiety, it wasn't real. But what if the absence of anxiety isn't a red flag? What if it's a sign you're finally safe? Truth 40. If your absence disturbs them more than your pain ever did, that wasn't love, it was dependency. If someone only panics when you pull away, but never showed up when you were quietly unraveling, they weren't loving you, they were using you to manage their own emotional emptiness. They didn't miss you, they missed your availability, your effort, your silence. And now, all of that is gone. Because you're no longer performing emotional labor in relationships where intimacy is one-sided. You're no longer contorting your needs to stay lovable. You're no longer translating your boundaries into palatable sound bites, because you don't need to be understood by those who refuse to see you. Truth 41. The more healed you become, the more boring you are to people addicted to drama. And that's okay. Let them say you've changed. Let them say you're distant. Let them say you don't engage. They're right. You don't. Because peace is your new home. Because emotional chaos no longer excites you. Because you spent enough of your life confusing adrenaline for affection. And now, you're not chasing connection that comes at the cost of your soul. This is the revolt, the beautiful, terrifying revolt of the old self. It screams at first, it mourns, it shakes, it wants to go back to what's known, to what's safe. But you don't go back. You can't. Because once you've tasted freedom, you no longer hunger for validation. You hunger for truth, for clarity, for presence. And as that old self falls away, you start to feel it. Slowly, quietly, your real self emerging. Not the self who bends, not the self who explains, not the self who waits for permission. The self who says, I'm not sorry for existing, I'm not sorry for needing, I'm not sorry for no longer abandoning myself for love. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of wholeness. Not perfection, not peace that avoids conflict, but peace that comes from standing in your truth, even if it means standing alone. Because you're no longer available for relationships that require your silence. You're no longer the safe space for people who harm you softly. And you're no longer the person who confuses endurance with love. You've revolted, and in that revolt you've remembered yourself. There's a moment, quiet, not celebrated, when you realize that your pain no longer dictates your patterns. You feel the trigger, you hear the tone, you recognize the manipulation dressed as care, but instead of reacting, you breathe. Instead of explaining, you walk, and instead of spiraling, you smile, not because it didn't hurt, but because it no longer defines you. This is what psychological sovereignty feels like. Not control over others, but mastery over yourself. The ability to respond from truth rather than trauma. The power to protect your peace without guilt. The knowing that you no longer owe anyone a version of you that you've outgrown. Carl Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But what he didn't say, at least not outright, is that this privilege comes at a cost. You must leave the old world behind. The world where you performed connection, where your nervous system was a battleground, where your worth was measured by how much you could tolerate without breaking. Sovereignty means you don't live there anymore. And yes, you will be misunderstood because you no longer speak in the language of chaos. You don't participate in performative suffering. You don't flinch when someone tries to bait you into a familiar argument. And, to the drama dependent, that makes you boring. But boring is just another word for boundaried. Truth 42. If their version of love requires your exhaustion, it's not love, it's performance. You're not meant to audition for care. You're not meant to chase conversations, prove your worth, or explain your sensitivity to people committed to ignoring their own impact. If someone only validates your pain when you collapse from it, they're not witnessing you, they're consuming you. But now you know better. You know what it means to be safe in your own energy. You know what it means to feel peace and not mistake it for boredom. You know what it means to walk away without needing them to follow. Because this is sovereignty, the refusal to be defined by what broke you. Truth 43. Some people bond through wounds, not values. And when you start healing, the bond breaks. You didn't lose their love. You lost the agreement, unspoken but real, that pain was your common language. They didn't love you. They loved the version of you that flinched, that questioned, that kept coming back for more. And when you stopped bleeding, they left. Not because you changed, but because they never learned how to love someone who wasn't dying for it. So you let them go, not with rage, not with bitterness, with clarity. And that brings us here, to the final truth. Truth 44. The final form of self-respect is walking away quietly, fully, without needing them to understand. You don't wait for closure, you don't craft the perfect final message, you don't rehearse what you'd say if you saw them again, because you don't need to be right, you just need to be done. Let me show you what that looks like. You wake up one morning. You don't check your phone, not to see if they reached out, not to reread old messages, not to punish yourself with what-ifs. You make tea, you open a window, you breathe, and something inside you clicks, not loudly, but deeply, a sense of internal silence, not numbness, not repression, but completion.